I thought I was standing in my own kitchen, making pasta for our daughter's dinner, living the ordinary Tuesday evening of a woman who believed her marriage was simply going through a rough patch. I had no idea that 3 rooms away, my husband was transferring another $400 to his perfectly healthy, fully employed mother. The same week, our daughter had worn the same pair of shoes 2 sizes too small for 6 weeks because I couldn't afford new ones. That was the beginning. That Tuesday. The pasta boiling on the stove, the steam fogging the window, my daughter drawing at the kitchen table with the focused seriousness that only 5-year-olds can manage. And somewhere behind the quiet walls of our apartment, Jason sat hunched over his phone, moving money that was never his to move. And by the time I found out the full truth, I would be sitting across from his mother at a dinner table surrounded by people we both knew, and I would say, clearly and without a single raised note in my voice, the thing that none of them would be able to unhear. We had been married for 4 years. Before that, we dated for 2. That's 6 years I spent building a picture of a man I thought I knew. A man who stayed up late to help me study for my nursing exams, who drove 3 hours in a snowstorm to be at my father's hospital bedside, who once spent his last $60 buying me a secondhand copy of the novel I'd been looking for since college, wrapped in brown paper, with a note that said simply, "You deserve beautiful things." I kept that note. I still have it somewhere in a box. I can't bring myself to throw it away, even now, which tells you something about the particular cruelty of being betrayed by someone you once loved without reservation. Our apartment was small but warm. We had made it warm deliberately, the way you do when you come from cold places, and decide that the home you build will be different. Lily's drawings covered the refrigerator in a chaotic gallery of stick figures and purple suns and horses that looked like melting tables. The living room had a worn velvet couch in deep green that I found at a thrift store and spent a weekend cleaning. Jason had laughed at the project, then confessed 3 months later that it was his favorite piece of furniture we owned. We had a small balcony where I kept a pot of basil and a pot of mint, and on warm evenings I would stand out there with a cup of tea and feel something close to contentment. Not happiness exactly. Happiness had started to feel complicated by then, but a kind of tenuous peace that I kept choosing to believe in, because Lily was there, because the mint smelled clean and green in the evening air, because I still believed that the quiet difficulties Jason and I were navigating were the ordinary friction of a marriage in progress, not the surface tremor of something hollowed out below. Jason was 34. He worked in logistics, a mid-level coordinator position that paid well enough but not brilliantly. I worked 4 days a week as a registered nurse, picking up extra shifts when I could, which meant leaving Lily at daycare for longer than I liked, and coming home with that bone-deep exhaustion that settles in behind your eyes and doesn't fully lift until your day off. Between the 2 of us, we made decent money. Or we should have. The numbers had never quite added up the way they were supposed to, and I had been attributing the gap to general inflation, to the rising cost of groceries, to 1 month's unexpected car repair and another month's dental bill. I am embarrassed now by how long I explained it away, by how many times I sat at the kitchen table with our bank statement spread out in front of me and told myself I must be missing something, because surely Jason would tell me if something was seriously wrong. I had trusted him with that, with the assumption that serious things would be spoken aloud between us. Brenda was 48 years old. She worked part-time at a garden center 30 minutes from her house, 3 days a week, her own deliberate choice, because she had told us more than once that full-time work was hard on the body, and she believed in protecting her energy. She was in excellent health. She had mentioned, with a particular kind of pride, that she hadn't needed to see a doctor in 6 years. She lived alone in a 2-bedroom house that her own parents had left to her outright. Paid off, no mortgage, hers free and clear. She had a car in good condition, a garden she tended with visible enthusiasm, and a social calendar that included yoga 3 times a week and a book club on Thursdays. By any reasonable measure, Brenda was a woman in complete possession of her own life and perfectly capable of funding it. She was also the reason my daughter wore shoes that bruised her toes for 6 weeks. But I didn't know that yet. My first memory of Brenda is from our second date. Jason had shown me her picture on his phone with a particular tenderness in his expression, a softness I had found touching at the time. "She's had it harder than she lets on," he said, and I didn't press him for details. I probably should have pressed. By the time Jason and I were engaged, Brenda had established a pattern of calling him every evening between 7 and 8, a ritual he never questioned and never missed. I noticed it the way you notice a small, persistent draft from an improperly sealed window. A chill that's always there, easy to ignore when everything else in the room is warm. She called it just checking in. Jason called it just how she is. I called it nothing, out loud. I learned to plan the evenings around it the way you learn to plan around any fixed inconvenience. Not with resentment, at first, just with quiet accommodation that I had already begun to mistake for generosity. Brenda had never been overtly cruel to me. I want to be clear about that because it matters. It's the explanation for why I didn't see it for what it was for as long as I didn't. She was careful in the way that experienced manipulators are careful. Deliberate, patient, working in a register too low for easy detection. She delivered her hostility gift wrapped in concern. She could say something that left a small, precise bruise and then look at you afterward with such warm and apparently genuine care that you found yourself questioning whether you'd imagined the bruise entirely. She told me once, at a Sunday brunch in her kitchen, that she admired how I had learned to manage with my unconventional schedule, as if nursing was a peculiarity I'd developed rather than a career I had trained years to earn. She once referred to our apartment, in front of mutual friends, as cozy, with a particular inflection that made the word mean something smaller than its dictionary definition. When I was pregnant with Lily, she brought a gift to the baby shower and then told the room that she herself had always believed children needed to learn to be resilient, looking directly at me when she said it. I smiled at all of it. I had learned early that smiling was the safest response to Brenda, the one that gave her the least to work with. The warning signs had been there longer than I care to admit. They had been threaded so carefully through the ordinary fabric of our daily life that I kept finding reasons to read them as something else. It started, as these things often do, with money mentioned casually, as if in passing. A quiet conversation in the car one Sunday afternoon in early spring. Lily asleep in her car seat, the radio playing low, bare gray trees filing past the windows. Jason mentioned, almost as a footnote to something else we'd been discussing, that his mother had run into a little difficulty with her bills that month. He'd helped her out. "Of course," I said, because what else do you say to that? She was his mother. I believed in helping family. It was one of the things I'd loved about Jason early on, that he was the kind of person who showed up for people. $50 here, $100 there. I told myself it was normal. It was what good families did. I didn't examine it too closely. I didn't track the frequency, but the frequency increased. In May, a bill for a plumbing repair at Brenda's house appeared on our joint account without prior discussion. A charge from a contractor I'd never heard of, listed matter-of-factly among our regular expenses as though it had always belonged there. When I asked Jason about it, he answered with the particular pre-loaded calmness of a man who has had time to prepare his explanation. It was an emergency. Brenda hadn't had the funds. He'd handled it. "I should have mentioned it first," he added, and the brief discomfort that crossed his face felt at the time like accountability. I accepted it as such and let the conversation end. I shouldn't have let it end, but Lily was teething. I was in the middle of a stretch of back-to-back shifts, and the energy required to push back on Jason's financial decisions felt like a resource I simply didn't have enough of. By autumn, I had developed what I can only describe as a background hum of unease, the kind that doesn't announce itself as a clear feeling, just lives quietly underneath your daily thoughts like a persistent low note you can never quite identify the source of. The numbers still didn't add up. We had both received small pay increases. Our fixed expenses hadn't risen significantly, and yet our savings had shrunk by nearly $3,000 over the year. I asked Jason about it once directly. He said it had been a hard year. He said it to the wall, not to me. I told myself he was stressed about work. I told myself I was catastrophizing, a word he had used about me before, always in the context of a concern that later proved to be entirely justified. The shoes were November. Lily came home from daycare on a gray Wednesday afternoon and mentioned in the matter-of-fact tone that small children use for all statements of equal weight that her toes felt squished. I took the shoe off and felt the toe box and knew immediately, with a parent's instant sick certainty, that the shoes were too small. I sat on the floor of her bedroom and counted back. She'd had these shoes since the beginning of the school year, nearly 3 months. She had worn 2 small shoes for nearly 3 months without complaint, because children accommodate discomfort the way water accommodates the shape of whatever contains it. I felt the cold, specific guilt of having missed something I should have caught. And then I felt something harder and more directional. We had 2 working incomes. We should have had the money for new shoes easily, without discussion, without any particular planning. Where was it going? That night, after Lily was in bed and the apartment had gone quiet, I went to the computer in the spare room. Jason was in the living room, the television audible through the closed door. I opened our online banking and I looked, not the surface-level glance I had trained myself to perform, the quick scan I ran to confirm the balance without truly reading what was beneath it, but a real examination, line by line going back 4 months. My coffee sat untouched on the desk beside me and went cold. The transfers appeared under a label I had either never noticed or had seen and not registered, BR Household Assist. They went out every 2 weeks with the reliability of a utility payment. $250, $300, $420. They were tidy, regular, unremarkable entries in a list of unremarkable entries, and they had been hiding in plain sight for months in the white space between the things I had been paying attention to. Over the 4 months I reviewed, they totaled $2,170, very nearly the entire missing amount, very nearly the precise sum our savings account had lost. My hands were cold. I remember that specifically. Not shaking, just suddenly cold in a way that seemed to come from inside rather than from the air in the room, as if the warmth had quietly withdrawn from my fingers of its own accord. I sat in the blue light of the monitor in the dark room, and I heard Lily turn over in her sleep through the thin wall, and I thought, BR. I thought, Brenda. I thought, $2,170, while our daughter wore shoes that hurt her feet. I read the transfers again and again. I needed my brain to catch up to what my eyes had already understood. I closed the laptop without touching anything else. I went to the bathroom and stood at the mirror for a long time, looking at my own face. And I did the thing I had learned over years of nursing. I slowed my breathing down deliberately. I held my expression still. I looked at the woman in the mirror and I made her look like someone who is simply washing her hands before bed, someone unremarkable, someone who has not just understood something that changes everything. I was very good at that by then. I would need to be better still. I did not confront Jason that night. I had learned from years of watching how Brenda operated, and from years of watching Jason navigate the impossible space between her and me, that there was a right time and a wrong time for the conversations that couldn't be taken back. That night was not the right time. The right time, I had already decided, would require witnesses. I spent the next 3 days being very quiet and very thorough. The morning after my discovery, I woke before Jason and Lily and sat at the kitchen table in the gray pre-dawn light with a notebook and a pen. Old-fashioned tools, chosen deliberately, nothing that lived on a shared device. I went back through 2 years of bank statements, not 4 months. 2 years told a different story, or rather, the same story, beginning much earlier than I had allowed myself to see. The BR Household Assist label had only appeared in May. Before that, the transfers were listed as payments to Jason's personal savings account, one I had always assumed he used for small private expenses. I had trusted him with it. Going back 22 months to the summer before Lily turned 3, the total funneled from our household to Brenda came to $11,400. I wrote the number on the notebook page in the neat block letters I used for patient charts, where precision was not optional. I sat with that number for a long time. The kitchen was cold. The mint on the balcony was covered in the first frost of the season. I thought about the vacation we hadn't taken, the one Jason said we couldn't afford. I thought about my broken zipper coat with the safety pin. I thought about Lily's shoes, $11,400. I did not cry. What arrived instead was a very particular kind of clarity. The kind that comes when confusion finally lifts entirely, and you see the shape of the thing that had been underneath it all along. It was almost a relief. On the second day, I found the messages. I was looking for a charging cable in Jason's jacket pocket, a completely ordinary act, and my hand found his phone instead, unlocked, screen still lit from a recent notification. The preview was visible before I could look away. It was from Brenda. It said, "Did you talk to her yet about March?" I need it confirmed before the Hendersons' dinner on Saturday. I stood in the entry hall with my coat still on, and I read that sentence 4 times. Then I opened the thread. The conversation went back 6 weeks. They had been discussing, in tones that were cordial and almost businesslike, a plan to increase the monthly amount once the new year started. Brenda had written, "I know it's tight, but she's working full-time now. There's no reason it can't go up." Jason had replied, "I'll figure it out. Just don't bring it up with her directly. You know how she gets." Brenda had sent back a single word, "Obviously." 3 weeks later, she had written about a boiler repair. $300. Could he do it by the 15th? Jason had replied, "Done." No hesitation. No, let me check. The same week, I had moved $42 from my personal account to cover a grocery shortfall. You know how she gets. I put the phone back exactly where I had found it. I ran cold water over my wrists and stood at the bathroom mirror and practiced the expression of a woman who has not just understood something that changes everything. The Hendersons' dinner, Saturday, 3 days away. I called Meg from the hospital parking lot between shifts. Meg had known us since before the wedding, had met Brenda enough times to have formed a precise and unflattering view of her that she'd always expressed with more restraint than she clearly felt. I told her what I'd found. I heard her go quiet in the particular way that means the person isn't shocked, but is choosing words carefully. "How much total?" she asked. I told her. A long silence. "What are you going to do?" I told her about the dinner, about obviously, about you know how she gets. Another pause. "Do you want me there?" I said yes. I also called a family law attorney Thursday afternoon, parked on a side street with the engine off, taking notes in the same notebook. The attorney used phrases like dissipation of marital assets and documentation trail, and I wrote them all down in my precise block letters. I was not ready to use them yet, but I wanted to hold them. I wanted to know they existed and that I could reach them when I needed to. Jason was unusually attentive that week. Coffee in the morning without being asked, 2 offers to pick up Lily, a carefully casual mention of the dinner on Friday evening. "Should be a nice night," he said, watching my face. I gave him the smile I'd spent years perfecting, warm, unrevealing, complete. "It'll be great," I said. He looked relieved. He should not have looked relieved. The Hendersons' house smelled of beeswax candles and something savory. Karen had set the table with autumn flowers and small votives that pooled amber light across the white cloth. There were 8 of us, Tom and Karen, longtime friends of both families, Karen's sister and her husband, Meg, Jason and me, and Brenda, who had arrived early and was already settled near the fireplace with a glass of red wine when we came in from the cold. She kissed Jason on the cheek and turned to me with her social smile. Wide, warm-seeming, the kind assembled entirely above the cheekbones. "Clara, darling, you look tired," she said. "Are they working you too hard?" I smiled. "Never," I said. The evening moved through its paces. Brenda was good at dinner tables. She knew how to make a room turn toward her without appearing to reach for it. I watched her and thought about obviously, and ate my salad, and waited. It was Brenda who opened the door, as I had known she would. She mentioned during a conversation about retirement planning that she thought young couples today were too fixated on individual financial independence and not enough on the family unit. She said it pleasantly, the tone of a woman sharing an observation she expected everyone to agree with. "When you're family," she said, settling back with her wine, "you pool your resources. That's what family means. Everyone contributes. Everyone benefits." She glanced at Jason when she said it. A brief, habitual check, not quite conscious. I caught it. Meg caught it too. I watched her set her fork down. Jason said nothing. He looked at his plate. The silence lasted 2 full seconds, and in those 2 seconds, the thing I'd been holding carefully all week came entirely loose. I set my own fork down. I took 1 small sip of wine and placed the glass back precisely in its spot on the cloth. Then I looked at Brenda. "That's an interesting philosophy," I said, in the voice I used when I needed a patient to receive difficult news without the interference of my own emotions. "I have some thoughts on the family unit and pooled resources, actually, if you'll allow me." I did not wait for her answer. "My husband and I have 2 incomes. Together, those incomes should allow us to save, cover our daughter's needs, and build something for her future. Over the past 2 years, $11,400 has been transferred from our household finances to support another adult in this family. An adult who is 48 years old, in good health, who owns her home outright, and who works 3 days a week by personal choice." I paused. Every person at the table was very still. Our daughter wore shoes 2 sizes too small for 6 weeks this autumn, because I believed we couldn't afford new ones. It turns out we couldn't, because the money had already gone to someone else's household. The silence that followed was the loudest I have ever sat inside. Tom Henderson looked at the tablecloth. Karen looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully name. Brenda's face changed, not slowly, but unevenly, like ice fracturing under sudden pressure, the social warmth going out of it and leaving something harder and older beneath. She opened her mouth. "Clara, I think you're exaggerating." "I'm not," I said. "I have the bank statements going back 22 months. I have the transaction labels and the amounts. And I have the message thread from last week in which you noted that since I was now working full-time, there was, in your exact word, no reason the transfers couldn't increase." I held her gaze without difficulty. He cannot adequately feed his child, but he fully supports his perfectly healthy 48-year-old mother. "You raised the subject of family values. I thought, since we're all family here, that was worth saying out loud." Brenda turned to Jason with the instinctive pivot of a woman so long accustomed to having him absorb her crises that she reached for him without thinking. "Jason," she said, her voice stripped of all its social warmth, leaving something sharp and slightly frightened underneath. "Tell them this isn't what it sounds like." Jason looked up from his plate. He looked at his mother. He looked at me. His mouth opened slightly, and I watched him search, as he had searched his entire adult life, for the sentence that would satisfy everyone and cost nothing. He didn't find it. He looked back down at the table, and he was silent. "He's not going to," I said, "because it is exactly what it sounds like." What followed was not dramatic in the way that word usually implies. It was the specific, airless discomfort of people who have heard a true thing, said plainly in a setting designed for pleasant untruths. Tom found something to say about dessert. Karen quietly stood and cleared plates. Meg refilled my wine glass and pressed her hand briefly against my arm without a word. Brenda sat straight-backed with her hands folded and the expression of a woman doing rapid, unhappy arithmetic. Jason did not speak for the rest of the evening. In the car going home, in the dark, wet silence of empty streets, Jason tried 3 times to begin a sentence. Each one dissolved before it formed. I just wanted to... Silence. She really did need silence. I didn't think you would... He stopped himself on that last one, and I was grateful he had enough left in him to stop on that one. You knew, I said eventually, just those 2 words in the dark. He didn't deny it. He looked at the road and didn't deny it, and that silence was its own form of full confession. The second twist came the next morning from Karen. She called my cell, not the house line, which told me she had thought carefully about making the call. She had overheard something at a garden party 2 summers earlier, a conversation between Brenda and a woman Karen didn't recognize, in which Brenda had spoken about Jason's arrangement with visible satisfaction and had mentioned, in a tone Karen described as, like she was planning a renovation that she was working on being added to their joint account, not as a transfer recipient, but as a full secondary account holder with access. Karen had told herself it wasn't her place. After Saturday evening, she said, she decided otherwise. I thanked her. I ended the call and sat for 7 minutes with my hands flat on my thighs, breathing through my nose. Then I called my attorney. It was true. Jason confirmed it that evening in the kitchen, door closed, Lily watching a film in the other room. Brenda had asked him 2 months before. He had not said no, and he had not told me. He had been looking for the right moment to bring it up, which in Jason's language had always translated to hoping the problem would solve itself without requiring honesty. I looked at him across the kitchen island and I thought about the note wrapped in brown paper. You deserve beautiful things. I thought, he had believed that once. The believing had not been enough to make him act like it. The transfers stopped. Jason called Brenda. The attorney sent a formal letter documenting 2 years of transfers and advising that any further unilateral movement of shared funds would be addressed through legal channels. Brenda did not respond to the letter. She sent a card 3 months later, addressed to Jason alone, hoping things would settle down and that he would be ready to talk soon. It was, to the very end, a message about her access to him, with me as the inconvenient variable. I read it because Jason showed it to me. Then I folded it and put it in the box with the brown paper note, because someday Lily might want to understand the choices that were made around her when she was small, and paper keeps. By spring, things had shifted in ways I had not entirely predicted. Jason had started seeing a therapist, at his own initiative, not mine, which told me something I had not been certain I would ever see from him. We were not repaired. I had stopped expecting repair and started expecting something more honest than that. 2 people trying to see each other clearly and deciding without illusions what was still worth building from what remained. We paid for Lily's shoes and her winter coat and the daycare enrichment program we'd been deferring for a year. We took a 4-day trip to a rented cabin near a lake. Lily caught her first fish and held it up with the expression of someone who has just understood something fundamental and irreversible about the world. I remember the first warm evening that spring, standing on the balcony with my tea, the mint returned to green and fragrant after the winter, the city rising up around me in the amber hour before full dark. Lily was inside singing something tuneless and self-invented from her bedroom, completely certain of its own logic. I stood in the smell of green things and cooling air, and I felt the difference between the peace I had been straining to hold before and the peace I was standing in now. Before had been the peace of a woman trying very hard to believe in something she suspected wasn't true. This was something steadier. The peace of a woman who had stopped pretending, who had said the true thing aloud in the room where it needed to be heard, and had discovered, on the other side of saying it, that she could breathe in a way she hadn't realized she had stopped doing. You can only keep someone else's silence for so long before it becomes your own cage. I gave it back, and in giving it back, I found that I had returned something to myself that I hadn't even known had been taken.